Okay, for today's masterclass, Catholic masterclass, we're looking at incense. Just a brief little point about incense. You know, you've heard me mention in previous sessions about incense, about how it's been present in the Old Testament temple and tabernacle, how it's present in the New Testament temple, the worship that we see in the heavenly liturgy in the book of Revelation. So let's just talk a little bit more about that. So the first place that we see this being commanded, of course, is in the same place we see a lot of the first times that we see worship being commanded. So again, we know before Moses that the people had this understanding of offering sacrifice to God as being an acceptable and appropriate thing. But it's only when Moses is up on Mount Sinai that the Lord kind of gives a formalized structure to their liturgy, to the people. And it's in Exodus chapter 30 during that section of the book of Exodus where God is giving Moses these instructions about the liturgy, about their worship, where we find incense being formally requested by God. And this is in the book of Exodus, chapter 30, verses 7 through 8. So in this, when God is commanding Moses to build the structure of the tabernacle, which later on becomes the temple in Jerusalem, he commands him to, of course, section off the different areas. You know, we've talked about this, the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the court of the priests, and the court of Israel, and the court of the women, and the court of the Gentiles, all these different places. So in the holy place, right before going into the Holy of Holies, which is like where the divine presence of God lives, is symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant. So right before the Holy of Holies, there's a veil that separates the Holy of Holies with the holy place. And just on the other side of the veil in the holy place, God commands Moses to build an altar that is simply for incense. Nothing, no other purpose. A golden altar that is, strictly speaking, for incense burning, offering incense to God. Now, why on earth would this be the case? Well, there's a number of different reasons. Among those reasons, there's an understanding in Scripture that incense points toward sacrifice. The altar, remember what happens on an altar is sacrifice. So the altar of incense is a place for sacrificing incense to God, which is, I suppose it sounds kind of strange, but think about this. If you remember from the book of Exodus, when God delivers his people from Egypt and brings them into the desert, how does he appear? Well, during the day, he appeared as a pillar of smoke, a pillar of cloud. And so incense is this pillar. It is symbolic of representing the way that God appears to the people in the desert, leading them out of slavery into freedom. So there's something there to that. There's also this sense that what does smoke do? Well, it goes upwards. When you burn a fire, when you burn something, what does it go? It goes upwards, which again is symbolic of prayers rising to God, our sacrifices rising to God. In fact, later on in Exodus chapter 30, God gives specific instructions even about how to make the incense, which I think is a really fascinating thing to think. He's like, okay, put this ingredient in and this ingredient. So it's like, this is even how you can offer incense that is pleasing to me, which is really neat. And then later on in the book of Leviticus, the next book of the Bible, when God is giving instructions about the Day of Atonement, this day where the high priest goes in, the one day the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, he is to burn incense before the Ark of God, the Ark of the Covenant. Again, why is that the case? Well, there's again a biblical principle that nobody can see God and live. And so the incense also acts as something that veils the sight, the vision of the high priest, so that he can't look directly upon the Lord. So he goes in there to offer sacrifice, which is also symbolized by the incense, but also he goes in there to see God, but he can't see him directly face to face. And so the incense it acts as like a veil between the high priest and the Ark of the Covenant, which is kind of a neat thing. Okay, so we see incense there in the Old Testament worship. Then in the book of Revelation, when we're talking about the heavenly liturgy, the heavenly temple, what is happening? Well, we see a couple of different images. In Revelation chapter 5 and in Revelation chapter 8, we see these images of the saints in heaven and the angels, the people in heaven. They're worshiping this lamb who was slain but now lives again. And as they worship, they're singing songs. They're also holding bowls of incense that the scriptures tell us are the prayers of the saints. Again, this incense, as it rises upward, it is symbolic of the prayers of holy ones, the prayers of God's people rising to him, like as though rising from earth into the heavens. That's something that incense symbolizes for us. And significantly, in chapter 8, Revelation chapter 8, the scene where we see that, the incense is being burned on a golden altar, which is pointing us back to the Old Testament worship, which the altar of incense was a golden altar in the holy place. So again, there's these altars that are strictly speaking set aside for incense, offering incense to God as a sign of sacrifice, as a sign of the prayers rising to the saints. Okay, so now just to summarize, what does incense do? Incense shows us, points toward sacrifice. That's a significant thing. And of course, we know that incense is not necessarily used at every single Mass, although it could be if the priest really wanted to. It's an optional thing. But whenever the priest uses incense, you can imagine this, that the incense points toward sacrifice. The incense points toward prayers rising to God. They are symbolic ways of engaging our senses. One of the senses is our vision, so that we can symbolically see our prayers rising to God. But then also engaging our senses, it helps us, to come more alive, actually, to come more alive as we come to God to worship, to actually engage our sense of smell, our sense of sight, so that we can see this taking place. Something comes alive for us in a fresh way. It also brings a kind of dignity to our worship. And again, it's not required to do. So it's not like our worship is necessarily less dignified if we are not using incense. But when do we think about this? When do you typically see incense? Most often you see it at the bigger masses, like at Easter or Holy Thursday. You see incense a lot of times at Christmas. Why? Because there's something about the dignified nature of the holy day that we're celebrating that is like, okay, let's spruce it up a little bit by bringing incense into it. And again, a priest could use incense at a weekday Mass if he wanted to. He could use it every Sunday if he wanted to. But we typically tend to see it at the higher feast days as a way to kind of reveal the greater dignity that is found in those higher feast days. And then lastly, it veils what is holy. And we'll talk more about veils in a couple of sessions, I think. But it also veils what is holy because of this biblical principle that no one can see God face to face and live. And to be sure, Jesus comes to us and he reveals to us his face. And so we can look upon Jesus face to face. But there is this sense of God is so holy in our worship that it can symbolically act as something of a veil that again just helps us to recognize the great dignity, for example, of the Eucharist. Sometimes you might see this, that the altar servers might come out during the Eucharistic prayer, and as the priest is holding up the Eucharist for our adoration, or simply if you go to Eucharistic adoration, the priest may sometimes use incense and swing the thurible, that incenser, before the Eucharist as a way of just, again, revealing the dignity of this great Eucharistic gift that the Lord gives us in his body and his blood. But there is also this sense of a veil that stands between us and God, just to bring an elevated sense of holiness. Incense is something that, I just learned this, it's something that's been used from the 4th century onward. So the first 3 centuries of Christianity was not legal. It was also, there was a lot of pagan worship that was associated with incense. And so they didn't use it for a number of different reasons, maybe to separate themselves from the pagans, maybe to not draw attention to their worship by using this fragrant scent, this cloud, the smoke. But once Christianity becomes legal, then it becomes much more common in the public places of worship where it's now allowed, it becomes much more common to use incense in offering their worship to God as a way, again, to elevate and to reveal what we're doing here is not just prayers, it's not just this really nice ritual thing, but it is truly an act of worship that we are offering to God. So I hope that's helpful for you, and I will look forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.